Howdy y'all, I am Ice Gold, and as of late, ever since Wallaroo came out, there's been this new divide in PvP between good schools and bad schools. And we've gotten to a point to where the Rochambeau wheel almost no longer exists. And right now, you are either a good school or you're a bad school, and nothing else really matters. School identity, per the wheel, does not matter anymore. And Jaddy, if you're watching this, I'd appreciate it if you could slide this one to the devs for them to watch, because this is pretty important, and if any of them want to talk with me some more, my DMs are open. Y'all know my tag by this point. So let's go over a bunch of the counter matchups again. I made a video about them back in November, but as I mentioned before, quote-unquote bad schools no longer counter, or they don't counter as well as they used to. And there definitely was still a divide then. There were a few quote-unquote counter matchups that favored the school getting countered, like Life was beating Death and Storm was favored in those instances, but that's just because, you know, Regenerate was insane, and the devs fixed that. So, I mean, Regen is still insane, but at least it's not like it's worth it to use it and then get immediately countered, so. But it has really gotten to a bad point now. Ice versus Death is a likely death matchup, and maybe around 20 more games, 1 out of 100 compared to the Ice. And per the wheel, as you can see, Ice is supposed to soft counter Death, but due to a plethora of reasons, Death still comfortably wins this matchup, and you could even argue it's a safe victory for Death in some situations, no matter the skill level. A good Death will almost always beat a good Ice, and a bad Death will also almost always beat a bad Ice. And then, like, a bad Death has a reasonable shot at beating a good Ice. That is just where we're at. That's what the likely label means. It's like the school is favored so much to where you can play a considerable amount like better than the Death as an Ice, and you can still lose just because of, you know, stat diffs and damage diffs and all that. Spell diffs mostly. And Evil Snowman is really our only saving grace in this matchup, and that's, you know, if they try and like threefold stack in Vampire at all, but otherwise they just beat us at every turn. They have better overtimes, you know, for less pips, so you can spam them easier and keep up the pressure. Almost 20% more damage, 9% more pierce, and effectively the same resist, since the soft cap of 70 still exists, which curves the only advantage we have over them down to around what they get after the curve. I think our 80% resist as Ice Wizards gets curved all the way down to 73-ish percent, 72, 73, and then Death gets off with around 71-ish because of the soft cap. So I love Wiz. They have better hits, they can drain, they have a far better Shad in Grim Reader, and Weaver is already pretty solid. I would still argue it's a top 5 Shad spell in the game, and their stats just totally wipe us, as I mentioned. And that's one counter matchup that ends up favoring the school that's supposed to get countered, and it favors that school pretty heavily in this case. Now, even at the very bottom of the ranking, we have Ice versus Storm, which, if you were to ask me, I would say I would call a lean Storm matchup, maybe around 5-ish more games, 1 out of 100 compared to the Ice. And again, per the wheel, Ice is supposed to be Storm's hard counter, but, you know, it just doesn't happen like that. And lately, the devs have been giving us so many tools to counter Storm in particular. Like, think about it, like Fomori Path B, definitely Depths, plenty more of that, but not enough Storms are queuing to where we would even want to pack those. And Fomori could be interesting since we'd have an easier time using our overtimes against schools that aren't Storm, which, you know, defeats the purpose. I mean, it's supposed to counter Storm accuracy, but it would be good against everybody except Storm because, you know, Wiz. And even with all our Storm-specific utility and our resist being very high and theirs being low, this matchup still favors Storm because they can just outrun our hits with Berry Surprise and chip us down way easier. Not to mention they've been starting to pack Lightning Bats just because of how good Death is, and Ice just ends up being collateral because of that. And, you know, I could really talk forever about Storm versus Death and how that is one of the safest matchups matchups in the game, and you know, storms are totally justified in carrying lightning bats for that particular matchup, but again, ice just ends up being collateral when that happens. So it's like, if the shoe fits, why not, right team? But yeah, either way, Storm is also an extremely bad school right now, but they are favored to win against Ice because of, again, heal spamming and cheap overtime counters. Now, Fire versus Myth has had some interesting developments happen to it over the last, you know, month and a half-ish since Wallaroo came out. And I would rate this as a safe Myth victory, and that's around 30-ish more games, 1 out of 100 compared to the Fire. And, you know, for a third time, a matchup where Fire is supposed to counter Myth, per the Rochambeau wheel, favors the Myth by a long shot. And Fire's two main gimmicks are traps and damage overtimes, but Myth just does the both of those better because they have Mythic Fuel if they use a pet that gives them, Cyclops for absolutely insane overtime trap value. They've also got a real solid trap gambit in their Scion. Delusion and Betrayal are there to counter mitigation, like weaknesses and shields. And then, you know, Basilisk just as a whole, which is kind of crazy, especially with how Troll is right now. And then, you know, Divum falls into that camp as well. And Stone Colossus will completely avoid weaknesses and create even more pressure with its defiant overtime. And a buff detonate in the form of Troll that remains bugged, causing a Basilisk detonate with just 2 buffs to completely erase a Fire's health. And I don't think I really need to say any more. I could go into how the two have the exact same damage and almost the exact same pierce, but Myth full pierces Fire while still having roughly 10% resist to a Fire's average pierce, but if you're watching this, you probably knew that already. So for Life versus Myth, I have rated this as a likely Myth, or around 15-ish more games, 1 out of 100 compared to the Life. And we're getting kind of close to the point where there are more counter matchups that favor the countered school than the school that's supposed to be countering, but like I said with Fire, a Myth can play pretty similarly and still win, albeit with slightly more difficulty since Life is good at countering overtimes and they have higher health and resist. It won't be easy, to just completely chunk a Life Wizard with a double buff Basilisk with the bugged Troll detonate, but you know, it's like you can still do it. If you have like heal counters in, or you have infects or dooms or whatnot, if you can stop them from healing, then you know it's very easy for a Myth to just use their broken mechanics and cards and all that to just completely shred a Life Wizard down, despite, you know, Life Wizards having something like, I think, 14.8k health for their cap. I think that's how that works. So, I mean, yeah, a Myth still should not have much difficulty beating a Life. Overall, though, you know, not much changes. Like, a Life can try to out-heal a Myth, but like I said, you know, all the Myth needs to do is buff, Tri-Shield, Basilisk, Troll, and the Life just has to pray they can keep a sack up long enough to regen enough times to keep them in the fight. And Life barely has any time to fight back, since a Myth will win a trade with every single one of Life's spells, which, of course, should be the case, since Myth has higher damage, but that leaves Life at a severe disadvantage when they should be countering Myth pretty hard. We're sort of at this point where if the school that is supposed to be getting countered just doesn't give the counter school anything to counter, it's like the match just becomes sort of lopsided, and that's kind of what I'm getting at. That's why, you know, Myth versus Life favors Myth. It's why, like, Ice versus Death pretty heavily favors Death. So that's just how it goes out here. For Myth versus Death, I have this rated as a tilt Death, or maybe around 3 more games, 1 out of 100 compared to the Myth. And, you know, this might be my personal favorite. Like, 2 of the 3 big dogs with so many broken spells in their arsenals going head to head. Myth counters weaknesses, so Grim and Vampire have much less value, and Scion is much harder to set up. Myth counters shields, so Oni is much harder to set up. And, you know, Myth also, for whatever reason, can still shift Death's overtimes back to them for mass damage, so how does this still favor Death, albeit at the narrowest possible margin that I can give it without calling it a toss-up? And the answer is, of course, the Wraith card. That's really about it. Ghoul and Wraith are able to keep death afloat versus a Myth, and although Myth's strong suit is damage, they'll have to do a hell of a lot more to a death due to drains. A double buffed Wraith is kind of hard to argue with, and a death doesn't even need bubble to achieve that. They just have to aura and then Ghoul, and you know, there you go. And then if they do have bubble, that's a triple buffed Wraith, which does like 3k for value of close to like 5,000 almost. So it's like a 5,000 swing in one turn because of a triple buff 6-pip card. Is like that's sort of where we're at. It's like Myth has such and it's so many insane advantages against a death, and all they have to do is just get buffs and then Wraith, and then it's like they're back in the game. And it's why I think that this matchup just barely favors death, like just a tiny bit more than Myth. And you know, not to mention, if a Myth sends a Yaga, the death can just Scarecrow and get so much health back from the drain. So the two schools are sort of in this little stalemate when it comes to chatting each other. It's like a death can't Grim because the Myth will just stone and do mass, and the Myth can't Yaga because the death will just crow, and that's a pretty insane drain just as it is. So having that on both the player and the minion is pretty wild. If the death does not give Myth anything to counter, like I was saying earlier, then the death is just ever so slightly favored. And this is truly a meta we participate in, fam. So those are my highlights. Those 5 matchups, among still others that I didn't get into here, go against what the Rochambeau wheel says is supposed to happen. And again, in this meta, you are either a good school or a bad school. And I haven't even talked about balance yet. Like, some, including me, say that balance is the best school at max level for the insane amount of utility that they have. Because, I mean, you'll look, it's like that. It's why I'm recording this video on my balance. Like, we have a counter to every single move every other school can make, except for protected overtimes. And then, of course, if there is a protected overtime in play of either kind, you know, damage or healing, then we can just dip into Storm to counter those. We see Balance is running Storm Pins and Bubbles now to help their Storm hits like Kraken and Triton, and then the Bubbles obviously benefit Hydra more as well. So like, just to go over some of the highlights here, a Balance can swap a blade, pop an aura, and do insane amounts of damage. Steel Ward, like, hello, like, really good ward and charm counters and all that. Literally a shift, a hit and shift. Like, and for a balance, this is insanely good. So it's sort of like, this card really desperately needs an audit. It's a hit and shift and snowdrift both in one. So it's like, you can use this against a death who spams poison and a life who spams, you know, like Goat Monk and whatnot. So that's nice. And then they also get the diffuses for free, so it's like if anybody tries to strike, that's sort of just chalking it. And then there's also a mana burn with, you know, its stalling mechanic and whatnot. Hydra obviously is insane. We basically have Ifrit on the school, except it does like a little less damage. So I don't know, man. Balance is just absolutely insane right now. And like, I don't even have a full arsenal of spells, so there's still more that I've got to go get. So, but I mean, those are kind of just the highlights. The point I'm trying to make is, some schools have so much more utility, better stats, the counters to every move you can make, more cards available, etc. compared to others, and it's created this meta where if you're not a Myth, Death, or Balance, you effectively stand no chance if you're against one of the big 3. And in my honest opinion, the school hierarchy looks a little like this. First place is Balance, favored in 7 out of 7 matchups by varying margins, 2 of which are just straight up logout conditions for the other school, being Ice and arguably Life, but mostly that's just a stall match, if that happens to you, so. And then Balance also has the best utility in the game by a long shot. Second place is Death, favored in 6 out of 7 matchups by varying margins. The best stats in the game with a drain mechanic exclusive to them. Only unfavorable matchup is a tilt balance, which I could really talk about at length down the line. Third place is Myth, favored in 5 out of 7 matchups by varying margins, best offensive capability out of any school with solid defense to boot, and the only unfavorable matchups are a tilt death and tilt balance. Like, if a Myth just fiends for the Jin, kinda not much you can do. After a massive gap in viability, you have Life coming in 4th place, favored in 2 out of the 7 matchups, amazing healing capability, and is the master of mitigation. 5th place is Fire, favored against Ice with a toss-up against Storm. They can keep balance on their toes, and can reasonably pull out a win against every other school except Myth. It is the most volatile school at max, and a good Fire can catch Death and Balance off guard pretty well. After another gap in viability, coming in 6th place, we have Storm, which is favored in 2 out of 7 matchups with a toss-up against Fire. It's got solid burst damage capabilities and surprisingly efficient survivability against chip schools with Barry, but if they get hit too hard, they fold, so that's interesting. They're also not great at handling shields. Elf is kind of real nice for them, but that's about it for them. Coming in 7th and last place, we have Ice, favored in 0 out of 7 matchups. Our only area of expertise is tanking, which other schools can also do while having way higher offensive stats. You've already heard me talk about Death and Myth and whatnot. So, as I'm sure you can tell, this is a problem. Like, if you look through the leaderboards, which I should actually go and check out real quick, and you look at the Premier League and you display the leaderboard, as you can see, the first person you see who isn't one of the big 3 schools or a full-on heal spammer in some cases, if it would let me click on it, okay, is Sauce's Life, and then after that, like about a page later, is like an Ice Trap Stacker with Liam's Fire down the line. And simply put, only 3 schools are competitive at max level right now, and you could just spam heals and make people flee as a Life, but even still, that's only 1 more school, and it's really pretty cheesy. I think KingsIsle needs to really do another spell audit for PvP specifically, because for this kind of divide to exist, it is a real issue. Ranking up on any school other than the big 3 is near impossible anymore. Like, you could get maybe Veteran, and then you'll only have to fight the big 3 to make it to Knight, and from then on, it's, again, just the big 3, and then your occasional Life Wizard who just, like, fiends for the Sanctuary and regens a bunch of times. And, we have truly slid back to a meta where 3 schools are insanely overpowered, and no one else has much of a chance without just cheesing it, like heal spamming on a Life or trap stacking on an Ice, both of which can still lose pretty easily to the big 3. And if any of the devs are watching this, please audit the Arc 1 spellements and a select few other cards like Wraith, and maybe take a look at some stats when you're about to roll out the Arc 2 spellements, because this needs to happen for the meta to be healthy. I, and probably many other PvP players, would be willing to help you with that. And, y'all could try an extended test realm or something like that. Just anything that allows us to help you help us, because I am looking at these boards, and the highest ranked Storm is number 56 on the board. And then there's only 1 Fire in the 1800 range. So, yeah, and then the rest of it is the big 3, and then Lifes that just tend to stall. So, how about that, chat? How about that? Well, thank y'all for watching. This is a topic that I'm pretty passionate about. It's PvP in this game is really something, and we're back in this meta again, like I said, where 3 schools just completely toss everybody else. And then, Life is also just sort of in there, but they can just heal a bunch, So, it's like, hopefully, at some point, the devs will make it so that the elemental schools are viable again, because it was like I was showing you, there are 0 storms, that are 1800 or above, and there's one fire that is 1800. So yeah, and I mean the only ices that are up that high are trap stacking. So that's just how I'm feeling about it. But yeah, thank y'all for watching. I've been Ice Gold. Be sure to like, subscribe, and leave like 50 comments for the algorithm. My Discord is down in the description if you want to chat with me some more, and I will see y'all later.